Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. With host and founder Richard Case and co-host and retreat leader Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, Kathy. How are you doing this morning out there in New Hampshire?
Good morning. Doing great. We are having gorgeous weather. It's been a really nice summer here. So gorgeous weather. Just got done actually meeting with my ladies group. We sat by the pool in the sunshine, sharing God's word and praying together. And it was a good morning.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, we're, into, obviously we're talking about the end times. We've been going through the signals of preparation that Jesus, when he was asked by his disciples, hey, you've talked about returning, which, by the way, they didn't completely get that at all because they were kind of mad when he left.
Right.
So they thought their kingdom, that the way it was going to operate, that they were going to take over politically now, which ultimately will be true in the millennium, by the way. Is that the Jews, and which will be converted believers, and then Christ rules physically on earth, so he'll physically be here, and so will we, because we get to come back and co-lead, and we'll be in our translated bodies, either raptured or from our place in heaven, and we're going to enjoy running earth, basicy. And the funny thing is,
there's a lot that happens first, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of there's just an interesting we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get into the covenant stuff, but a question came up of is there must be sadness in heaven because of things that have happened and what you know and don't know, and so it'll be interesting to discuss that issue. But when we're translated and we're coming back physically to be on earth, and we'll be with humans,
right?
So they'll be still sinful. They still have to receive Christ. They'll still have their self-centered nature. They still have to do the same things we've had to do, which is deny self, take up the cross, and follow him every single day.
And we'll still have mission in terms of sharing Jesus with them. Correct?
And we'll be able to say, well, there he is, And by the way, we can demonstrate, powerful things. But, the way that my mind thinks is I have all kinds of interesting questions. So we won't be sleeping. What do we do when the place we're at, if if I get to go to, Tuscany, hey, I get to participate in people in Tuscany. Well, when they're sleeping, what do I do? What are we going to be doing?
You've given this a lot of thought, haven't you?
And we get to eat because Jesus ate after he was, his resurrected body. But, well, physically, what happens to that stuff? Because right now we know what happens to it, but it's going to be different, because it's not. We won't have organs, anymore. So,
right.
Those are the kind of questions that I'd like to find out. Like, hey, well, how is this going to work, and what are we going to be doing? And it'll be really interesting. But we'll be physically here. But he says to be prepared and watch for, because of, again, prior to that happening. That the millennium, by the way, starts at the end of the 7-year tribulation.
Okay.
And everybody is, in essence, ever since Christ, has been waiting, because of what John and Daniel wrote, is that, people say, I'm waiting for Christ's return. Actually, we're waiting for the beginning of the tribulation, because that signals timeline, literally, of the return of Christ, because he comes at the end of that 7 years.
Right.
So he can't.
So once we see the tribulation begin, then we know we've got 7 years to the coming of Christ.
Right. And in a sense, he can't return relative to what he stated as true until that happens, because that's when it happens. So when we say I'm praying Jesus come, Jesus come, Jesus come, and I talk to people and say, okay, so what would you like to have happen? Oh, I want Jesus to return. I said, do you understand what that means? What? Actually, what you're praying for is the tribulation.
Right.
Is that has to happen first. Well, I don't want tribulation. I just want Jesus to return. Well, the way it works is Jesus is going to return at the end of the tribulation, and of course, there's the discussion of rapture, which we'll spend a little bit more time on over the next months.
Mid-trib, post-trib.
Well, yeah, but I'll be gone. Well, okay, maybe not. And I had an interesting discussion about that recently, by the way, with a group of people, and this was funny because it was at a secular event, and this person that I knew, believers' mother and dad were there, and they're elderly,
right?
And he's got a little bit of an infirmity, and so he's physically challenged a little bit. And we were just talking, and they've been listening to our podcast.
Oh, nice.
And she came up to me and said, "Oh, it's a real privilege, to be able to talk to you." She says, "I got a big question for you." What? What happens to the people that think the rapture is pre-trib, but it isn't? And I said, "Well, why do you? What does that matter to you?" She says, "Well, from my read of Scripture, I don't see it like you see it. I don't see it being absolute. And it's possible that we're still going to be here. But people around me in my church, they're telling me it's absolute, and I'm not sure what do I say to them, and what's going to happen." I said, "Well, if we're still here, we're going through the tribulation,
right? And
God's going to guide us and protect us, and again, I said some will be martyred, but we'll be protected even in that." And I said, the way to present truth is to say, "Well, are you so certain of that statement?" And people usually say, "Yeah, I'm pretty certain." Okay, where did you get that? Usually, as my church said so, or my pastor said so,
right.
Or a book that I wrote said so.
Or a podcaster that they're listening to.
Or a guy that I've written, and say, okay, so
YouTube videos.
But what does Scripture say? Does Scripture describe it as absolute, which is what she described as? I don't see it being absolute. I don't think we can make that definitive statement. But I need to know, how do I help people get to that point? I said, well, help them get into the Word if they have a heart to get to the Word, and then just make a statement. Do you see that it really isn't absolute? It's stated, and by the way, what do we do now? We're going to be raptured. That's true.
Right.
We just don't know the timing of it exactly.
Right.
So she was like, "Oh, okay, I can do that." And she was really funny and excited about growing in Christ and learning what it means to walk in the covenant and this end time stuff. So it's been fun. She said, "I've really enjoyed getting a balanced biblical perspective on it all." And I'm going to try to help people understand that as well, because that was a big question she had. But Jesus says that as it approaches, because that's the disciples had said, "When is this going to happen?" And he goes through a series of statements, which you've been through, but he makes a statement that watch and be prepared. And it's both observe, understand, and I think because of the breadth of it, particularly as we've talked through, like, for example, the churches, I think that discussion of the churches was universal, and it was for all time, that, where do you stand, children, in relationship to what I've intended the church to be, and while you're evaluating that, every day, every month, every year, even as it's headed 2,000 years later, I want you to consider that. I want you to pay attention to that, and then be aware of the signs and the signals, and be ready. And the two levels of readiness would be, first of all, spiritually, that we aren't, in other words, we're not tied to the earth or the material things of the earth, or that I've got to have it operate a certain way because it could change, during my lifetime. And I think he's trying to imply a couple things. At some point in time, it's going to really happen. The tribulation is going to start, and it's going to happen. And one world government, and the Antichrist is going to step up, etc. I think the other thing he was trying to tell us is that when you think of the variation of what that means, don't be surprised that during your life there's significant variation in the economy, culture, government, things that happen, the way things are operating, so that if we would have gone back to, Europe in World War II, and you're in England, or you're in Austria or Poland, and Hitler's coming after you, or France. There's a great book, that I've read that actually has some cool thoughts about the remnant, and that it's called Wine Wars, and it's after occupation of France by Germany. Well, they had obviously all these vineyards that were still trying to function. And it's a great description of how they worked under a brand new regime to try to live. They had different life, but as well as how could I still enjoy life under this awful thing that was happening to me. And it's a great description of how they did it, and how they actually didn't fight against it. They actually cooperated and tried to get friendly with the local leader of that German regiment to allow them to do certain things, like, for example, think of wine production. What do you need? You need bottles. Well, they needed bottles, and so they worked it. So, hey, can you get me some bottles that I know other people can't get, but you can get it, and these guys would get them for them, And so it was really a cool thing.
Interesting, yeah.
So anyway, it's preparation, both spiritually, that, okay, are you ready? And be careful that you're not tied to what you think should happen circumstantially at any time. And then physically, that as things come, and like with Joseph, for example, when they went through that famine, well, God warned them. And said,
he alerted him on how to prepare.
It's
for
coming
that.
up. Here's what I want you to do. Save up. Get ready for the famine that's coming, so that you can make it through. And then at the end of that, you'll be able to come back to production and a variety of things. So that we got to be careful that we don't attribute a false sense of faith. I don't need to be prepared because God's going to take care of me. Isn't that trust? And God says, well, trust is in what I say, and what do I alert you to. And that's why he said, be aware and be prepared. Don't go do it on your own, and don't follow a what I would call a prepper. And okay, here's the 25 things you got to go do, and make sure you do it and get it all ready. And no.
I'm glad you said that, because that is one of the things that I hear a lot of people doing right now, is just going online and finding a list of what the prepper is saying. Like, how about you ask God? Because what you're going to need in your particular circumstance in your community may be very different than what someone else is going to need. And wouldn't you rather go to the source?
Yeah.
And
it is going to be dependent, by the way, on the community. So who do you have around you, and what things can you do together, and what would be staples and things that you might want to build up on. And by the way, again, there's no formula to that. So it may be, get a few extra cartons of toilet paper, for example, but you don't need to go buy 30 things of toilet paper, unless he says so, by the way. And he can.
And if he does, then do.
And by the way, he can say, start here, and as it gets closer, I can tell you to increase it. Get
Right.
ready because, hey, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, just like with Joseph. So preparation. So the signals are keys to watch. Okay, there's two gigantic things that happened this week. Now, this is taped a week or so before what we're doing, so maybe you've heard of it. Interesting enough, these two things nobody knows. Nobody knows because it's not been publicized at all, but it's so.
Oh, I wonder if it will be by the time this airs.
You know what? I doubt it. But here it is. Number one, Russia linked up with China on oil production, and Russia became the lead and supplanted Saudi Arabia as China's oil producer.
Really?
Yes, big time, and paid for not in U.S. dollars. Now it's paid in yuan, and they bypassed the system. And okay, gigantic news because as you look, remember we talked about this. Gog and Magog partner up. That's China and Russia.
And Russia, wow.
And
now where is this news coming from?
This is
share that?
Well, it's coming from the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, okay.
So there's an article, but it hasn't been picked up by the news stations.
Okay.
So, because they keep track of stuff like this, and so it's there, and it's so. So it's been reported, and it's been reported now as true, and it's a shift, big time shift in the alliance structure of things that Russia and China, and I think again this is what we even talked a little bit about this. Remember when we said Russia is coming across as weaker than we all thought. Because we thought, man, they could just go in, take over Ukraine, and then they can go from there.
Right. But that has not been the case.
They haven't been the case. And as it went on and on and on, and still is on, by the way, Europe has reduced, purchase of oil from them.
Right.
Well, guess what? They need the income from it. So, and I believe this is
why they've gone to China.
Yep, this has been working. Is hey, let's you and us partner. Because we have common objectives, and that is to overcome the West. And so Gog and Magog are forming up. And the alliance happened economically. I mean, this literally is gigantic news. Okay, now the next one.
Wow.
Now the next one, and I bet you didn't hear about this. Did you know that Israel's government collapsed 2 days ago?
No.
Yeah. It's not known. That hasn't been reported. The government collapsed 2 days ago, and
tell us more. What is that? What does that mean?
They have to go through a fifth election in 4 years, and
so I did see a tiny headline that said Israel facing another election, and I just thought it was time.
Yeah.
I wasn't following it close enough, so I just assumed it was.
And
it was
so
time. I didn't realize it was a collapse. So fill us in.
And this is see the difference between Israel, who's a democracy, and the United States, who's a democracy. We go to the polls.
Right.
And we elect senators, congressmen, and the president. And it doesn't matter how many different parties or people are on those ballots. So that I don't know if you remember this, but back in I think it was the 80s and 90s. That Ross Perot ran as president.
I do remember that. Yeah.
Well, he was a third-party candidate, independent. If he would have been elected, he would have been the president of the independent party, and then there would have been maybe some independents in Senate and Congress, but mostly Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
Right now, if a Senate slate includes a Democrat, Republican, Independent, other party, even a communist party, for example, if they got elected, they join the system, whatever they join at that level, and it is what it is. And they don't have to have a majority of the vote. So that if, let's say there's 4 people running for president, and the top one gets 35% of the vote, he's the one.
Okay.
That's who's elected. It doesn't matter.
Doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be majority. It's okay. Now here's the difference. Israel operates by majority, so that
and this is why they've had so much gridlock between the two, the two Benjamins, right?
The 2 Benjamins, which, by the way, was a prophecy, said that there would be 2 Benjamins would cause the gridlock, and it is. So they do not elect individuals in terms of all the different positions. They elect parties.
Oh, interesting.
So you vote for the Likud party or the Green Party or some other party.
And then is the entire cast is what I want to say. That's not the cast, but the entire that entire party. So if there's an entire party shift when a new person comes in of a different party, then everybody is out. Is that?
Well, I'll tell you how it goes. So they elect parties.
Okay.
Well, for a long time, there's never been a majority party because they can't get it. There's too many parties. So, like, for example, the last election, there were 8 parties elected. And so the top one only got, maybe 37% of the vote. And then the next guy gets 10, and the next guy gets 10, and all the way down to 2 or 3%. But they all have position. Okay. Well, the person that has the top vote, the party that has the top vote, is given the 30 days to put a alliance together, coalition, and you try to get enough of the other parties to agree that they'll join you to reach a majority, and now we will rule as a majority, and the person who's the head of that party that started it is the prime minister.
Okay.
And he's charged with managing the bloc.
Right. And so then do those who did not win, did they come in if they formed an alliance with him? Or are they actually coming in on his team?
They can.
Or just
they can
their
either.
party is
They
coming
can
in on
either
his
form an
team?
alliance, or they can say, "Well, we're not going to be part of your group, but we'll be part of the system because we got 25% of the votes, or we have 25% of the people that can vote on options. So we're primarily not going to join you. We're going to kind of work against you. But somebody has to get a majority. Now, for the last 4 elections, Netanyahu was a member of the prime minister, and they couldn't get a majority. So, and nobody would form an alliance.
Right.
So he operated really with no official government, and it was a government in place, and he was running it, but they couldn't make things happen, because they couldn't get enough votes to do it. At the last one, the party that won, and the guy's name is Bennett, he got the alliance. And so he got all these parties to join him and form the government. And so he said, "Okay, you're the prime minister. You now have control," and Netanyahu's out. Okay, so what happened is that, and think of, and I'm going to try to give you a picture of this as to why the democracy that was attempted to start in Iraq fell apart. Well, Iraq was 3 different sects: Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds.
Okay.
And guess what? They hate each other.
Right.
So they could never agree, ever. And they fought each other internally, even though they were charged with forming a democracy. Well, that's what happened in Israel. Is these guys that said, "Okay, I'm in the alliance, Now it's starting to play out in actual voting, actual things to deal with, and they fought each other and said, I'm not supporting you. Unless you do what I want, I'm not going to support you. And they tried and they tried and they tried and they couldn't get it done. And they finally said, we can't do it. We're out. And the parties pull out. We're not going to join. We're not in your alliance. It goes below 50%. He's out. And the government literally collapses.
Wow.
And they can't function. So they got to call an election in 30 days, go through the whole.
This just happened.
This just happened this week.
Okay.
And this is big news of unsettling in Israel, because a shift is happening here. Something is up. And instead of where they were headed and the factions developing, it's all collapsed, literally collapsed, where there's now can't function. They form a new government by going through another election. And they actually took, to appease everybody, they just removed the prime minister. He just stepped aside and said, okay, the next guy, you just come in and keep it together.
Just for these 30 days while they have
30
an election.
days until then, by the way, what's going to happen is they'll have an election. Nobody will get majority. They're going to have to go through the whole thing all over again. Can they form up a government? How can they do it? Now, because of what happened, Netanyahu's party, which is called Likud, likely can get close to a majority. And all they need is one other. Instead of this group required 8 parties to get to the majority, Netanyahu probably will only need one other party, to join him. And now you got a majority. Now you can rule. And so it's likely that they'll get more votes than normal. And I don't think they'll get majority, but they'll get close enough that they can just get one other group to join them. And now the two of them who are going to think alike, okay, we can run the show. So I think, and by the way, the Likud is extremely pro keeping the land, the biblical land in Israel. And they're not willing to give it up, and they're not willing to compromise, and they're not willing to put up with the Muslim attacks.
Right.
And so I think there's a shift to forming up a stronger Israel, which think about the end times. The whole world comes against them.
Right.
And then they have to protect it, and God does protect them, and they become the source of what we talked about, the millennium. So these two things are gigantic pieces.
These are big pieces to be watching.
Pieces of things to watch. And so we got to watch them. So we got to pay attention to, okay, how does China and Russia line up further? What do they do to strengthen their coalition? How does that mean? Iran's going to be part of that, by the way, and Turkey from the Middle East. So we'll see how that plays out and where they land on that. And then we really got to watch, and I'll try to keep up with this and report it, what's happening in Israel, because and it was one of those, it's kind of funny thing, because like you said, there was an article that you saw, new election. Well, it's because it collapsed. And that would have made a difference.
Interesting. The headline, you would think, with the way clickbait is government collapses.
Yeah.
But no, it's just a new election.
Yeah.
So definitely flying under the radar.
So we will pay attention to this, and it's going to be big stuff for us to process. What does all this mean? Because things are lining up structurally. And again, we're not saying we know that portends a specific timeline, but it's like,
But we are seeing forward movement, and at a speedy rate.
Yeah. And remember, Jesus made a statement of pay attention to the signs. And these are very specific things. Because remember, last time we talked about when you see the fig tree come back to life, that generation is going to see the end. Well, that appears to be Israel. And because they just became formally a nation in mid 2012 to 15, that generation could be the next 40 years of people that see something, and maybe this is it. And again, I use the word maybe because I can't Jesus said, don't get too precise about
Right.
this. And stay in that tension of yes, but not yet. Watch, but don't stop living. But also don't be ignorant of what's happening. And as he said, as it happens, it will accelerate. He does say that. Things are going to accelerate, and maybe this is part of the acceleration. So this is just stuff to watch.
Yeah, very interesting. And I just want to highlight again, we've said this before, but as you share this in the maybe but not yet, and just kind of continuing to abide and ask and seek, a word of warning to beware of those who say they know.
Yeah.
And really, there's warnings throughout the Bible on that, but we really do need to be cautious of that, because I think there are a lot of people who are so uncomfortable living in the tension of it's coming but not yet. They're so uncomfortable in that when someone can give them a date and a timeline, that is, even though it sounds horrible, it's a something for them to hang on to, and that's a comfortable place for them to feel like they know something.
Right.
And we are warned against that. Somebody does not know. So if they're telling you that, go the other way.
Right.
Quit listening to that source.
Yeah, and next time we'll actually talk about, we've talked about the Matthew, and one of the discussions we'll get into next time will be the parable. It's called the parable of the virgins. Jesus talks about this specific thing about preparation.
Yes.
And the necessity of it. And because of the breadth of the time of it, that's why we got to be careful that we don't redefine or predefine preparation and say, okay, I'm going to go do. And he says, well, you can, but it's not going to matter, because it isn't really yet time for that. But I want you to think spiritually, be prepared, and when I give you instruction, which is what we're going to talk about in that parable, really focus on what I say.
Yes,
so
that's great.
So we'll talk
Absolutely.
about that. Anyway, so that was kind of interesting stuff today.
Very interesting. I'm glad you shared that. I would not have noticed either of those ththings out of headlines that I've seen.
No, and it's not widely publicized, but it's true, and we're going to watch it, and it's going to make big news. So we'll pray that everybody receive that as this ought to be interesting, and then we'll try to help. We'll try to unpack it as we go down the path. So we will see you Monday for our covenant study, and we'll pick this up again next week.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, and thanks for joining us, everyone. As always, if you have questions, send them in at questions@afjministry.com, and we will get those on the air.
Yep.
So thanks for joining us. Have a fantastic weekend.
Okay, see you.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. Send us your questions and comments, and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.